What does success look like? This is a favorite line by my next expert on how to help you get promoted in the workplace, Melissa Creede. Melissa, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Nancy.
So, Melissa, your key aspect that you help people with is becoming more strategic and starting to think more strategic because we live in this world of overload and distraction. Can you share what does it mean when people are trying to step up the corporate ladder to be more strategic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that many of my clients ask themselves too when they get that feedback. Okay, well, what am I supposed to be doing differently? I filled out that budget form that you asked me to fill out for next year. But it's much more than just the formal strategic planning that we might do in an organization. So there are some formal pieces of being strategic, but I'm going to talk even more about the day-to-day parts of being strategic. And for me, the biggest one is being intentional rather than reactive. So the average leader spends 27 hours a week in meetings and in emails, just those. And I actually, from my experience, it's more than that for most people that I work with. And so we end up in a reactive state. We're reacting to deadlines. We're reacting to emails and requests and messages on our other platforms. And we never really get a chance to sit down and think, what's the most important thing for me to be working on? So that intentional versus reactive is a big piece about being strategic on a day-to-day basis and over time, of course. There's being future focused and not just what's happening today. So even 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, depending on the level you're at. There's something about being more big picture than just in the details. I often have people look at what does someone 2 levels up from me care about, because it's really hard for us to imagine. We can be strategic in our roles, but we're not always strategic from our boss's perspective. Strategic is looking at upcoming trends or things that are happening in your industry, but also in other industries that might overlap. And then there's also a piece about just like across sectors and across the organization, which are two different things, but they sort of are like an interconnection look at what else is happening. So there are many pieces of being strategic. And I think, and not everyone has to be all of those things in every role, but I think we need to be intentional about what we choose to be strategic about rather than just reacting every day for everything that we do.
I love that concept of being more intentional. And I'm going to ask this question two different ways. So I'm going to have you answer it first in the negative perspective. If I am so focused on the day to day in the details and not being strategic, what does that do to hold me back from getting a promotion?
Oh, yeah. So many people get to a certain level because they were very good at executing. And that's what they've been promoted for. That's what people rely on them for. But to go to that next level, and I mean, every single level has this different piece, but I see this a lot between sort of a director and a VP level. Depending on the organization, titles mean different things in different places. But it's sometimes even from manager to director. And it's you are no longer only valued for your expertise and what you can do and what your knowledge is. It's also how you can anticipate things, how you have a vision for where you want to bring either the department you're in charge of or the project or the initiative you're in charge of, but having some forward looking at where are we going, what's our plan to get there, and then being able to communicate that. So when people don't spend the time doing this, spending some time about looking at those things, they might be a very valued employee as an executor, but it does hold them back from those higher levels. And they're just not seen as strategic. Maybe they don't get invited to the important meetings that are making bigger decisions in the organization. Often it holds them back in promotions, which I know this whole event is about. I see this many, many times where people are told they're just not strategic enough for the next level. And they don't really always know how to translate that into what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. And it's so true. One of the things that I talk about and I think is really important when you are moving up the corporate ladder is you want to move from this concept of applying for jobs to being someone who people above you see and come tap on your shoulder and say, hey,
Yeah.
we want you in that next meeting. And being strategic And understanding strategic thinking is really critical to being that person they recognize and that they want to invite to meetings. So I appreciate that a great deal. Now, earlier you made a comment that not only do you need to understand your boss's strategies, but what is strategic for your boss's boss.
Yeah.
And so if I am an employee trying to figure out how to move up that ladder, what is something that I can do to help get better at understanding what my boss's boss wants?
Yeah, it's very hard, and the bigger the organization, the harder it is because they're even more removed in a lot of ways. But some organizations, and I highly encourage this, and many of them do this, they have something called skip level meetings. So that's when
Mm,
you're having a meeting with someone either two levels down from you or two levels up from you. And sometimes they're just quarterly or twice a year in very senior positions. But those are great opportunities if you have them to find out what's your boss's boss vision, what risks do they see, what are they thinking about. So if that opportunity is available, and sometimes you can just ask for it if it isn't already commonplace in your firm, but that's one great way. Asking your boss questions about if your boss is representing something in a meeting that you had a piece in, you can ask them, well, was it received? What questions did people ask? What were the pushback items? So just rather than just getting briefed on what happened in the meeting, asking really specific questions about the dynamic of the meeting and where other people either got stuck or they were on board right away or they asked more questions. So that's another way to find out. And sometimes you're just also guessing and testing. So you try something, but you can get further along with this by asking really good strategic questions. So if you have the opportunity to speak with them directly, it's best. But even in meetings, you can ask, rather than asking the details of something, you might ask what their 3-year vision for this is, or what would success look like, as you mentioned at the beginning, what would success look like at the end of this program, or what's the purpose of this initiative, and how does it further the goals of the organization. So there are many strategic questions you can ask your boss, your boss's peers, your boss's boss or their peers. So questions, and then sometimes just observing. If you happen to be able, you can sometimes ask to be part of certain meetings as an observer. Maybe you can't go to the whole senior leader meeting, but you may be able to come for 20 minutes for something if you ask for that, and just observe and notice the dynamic. Notice where people stop and ask more questions. Notice where things just breeze through. Notice each person's perspective around a particular issue. These are all things that you have to do over time, but there are ways to get a better idea of how this fits.
yeah, I really like that concept of seeing if you can have those skip level meetings. So
Yeah.
the place I work for, they call them manager once removed meetings. So it's
Oh,
that
great. Yeah.
your boss's boss. And I remember working for that company, and they were really strategic about how you could move up because your boss may only know a certain amount of information, but your boss's boss has insight into opportunities that may be going up, where they want to grow. And so I love that you're suggesting we want to get better at asking questions, being
Yeah.
inquisitive around what is going on and why is that important for the company,
Yeah.
so that you can start to align yourself with that perspective.
Yeah, and some
Um,
organizations don't have that already, but if you ask, sometimes they're willing to do it and say, and
yeah,
if they ask, well, what do you want this meeting for? You can just say, like, I'm really trying to get a better view of the organization. I do get a lot of this from my own boss, but I thought it might be interesting to see your perspective. And you can ask for 20 minutes. Like, not every organization will say yes, but it is a pretty common thing in many of them.
yeah, and the thing that's really important about learning to ask
Yeah.
to have those conversations is you get seen as somebody who wants to be promoted. You get
Yeah.
seen as somebody who is interested in the bigger vision of the company.
That's
Because
right.
when we don't ask, when we hope that they will just come to us and we stay stuck in the day to day, you can be seen as a really good doer
Yeah,
and not as a good leader. And so developing that strategy of becoming a strategic thinker. Uh,
absolutely. The proactive part is key, and taking initiative, as you said. But even when you ask strategic questions and you have strategic conversations, you're labeled as more strategic. Because there's an interesting phenomena that you kind of just alluded to is when you're seen as an expert or when you're seen as an implementer, sometimes those are two different things. It can be at the detriment of being strategic. That's being seen as strategic. It's not always true, but there is a bias that, oh, that person's great at implementing. So people automatically assume they're not as good at being strategic, even when some people can hold those both very well. So we have to work at the strategic piece, especially if we're coming from a role that didn't require that as much.
Yeah, and so true. We have to work at each of these different strategies that
Yeah.
are coming out for how to move forward. And if you are somebody who hasn't thought a lot about being strategic and are showing up and being like, okay, I'm a hard worker, I'm putting in the time, I'm doing the effort, sometimes that, as we just said, can hold you back. And so this concept that Melissa is sharing about being more strategic is really important. Now, Melissa, I also know that you've written this great book called Beyond Your Inbox, Intentional
I'll
Leadership in
show
a
you here.
Distracted World, which is awesome because it's just recently released. And when you were thinking of writing this book, what was it that kind of inspired you to say, you know what, this needs to be talked about more, especially in helping people move up the corporate ladder?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was I had many clients telling me they were getting this feedback that they aren't strategic enough. And when I work with them one on one in my leadership coaching practice, I was giving them all these techniques and ways to do it, and sometimes really easy ways, sometimes a little bit harder ways to develop that skill and to be also seen more as strategic. And everyone was excited about it. They saw great success, and they would say, "Okay, so where can I read more about this?" And I've never seen anywhere where they had them somebody put them all in the same place. I've picked these up over the years and learned from my own experiences. But I'd never really seen a how-to book like that for just these concepts that I was sharing. So I kept having to say, well, you could read these 27 things and pull out one piece here and there. But that was sort of the impetus for me to saying, you know what, I really should put these down into some kind of book. So that's what led me to write it. It's written as a series of coaching sessions for someone who wants to be promoted. But it's very practical and hands-on, tangible things that someone can do.
Yeah, the book is great because it is written in that story format. So if you really like it and to see what the experience is, I think one of the great things for anybody who is looking at improving their ability to be more strategic and reach out to Melissa is great because this book describes that how she coaches, how she is giving that feedback, that insight to move up. And depending on the company, depending on where you are working, if your boss or if other members of the leadership organization don't have a lot of strategic conversations, like it's in the back room, Melissa can give you the language, the ways to approach people to start that conversation. And I will say this is one of the critical skills in helping you get promoted as you move up. Because initially, as we move from contributor to that first level, we are really starting to try and find our feet as leaders, as managers. But as you move up the corporate ladder, you need to become more and more strategic, not just internally, but if you work for a big company that has a board of directors, learning to actually move up to the board of directors, learning to move and hear what all of the investors in your company are doing. And so becoming a strategic thinker is critical.
Well, and it
Melissa, is
changes.
there any one
Sorry.
last thought that you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of finish something you just said. It changes at every level what we need to do. So yeah, you're mentioning that when someone works for the board. So if I work with someone in the C-suite and how they interact with the board, because they also have to figure out the dynamics of that board. So every level can benefit from this. Sorry, repeat your question for me. One last
I said, was
last
there
thought?
any, yeah, were there any other comments or is there any other points that you want to make that you think before we end this interview?
I'll just give one more tip that is very hard to implement at first, but it has the biggest impact. It's the one that has the biggest impact when people actually start to implement it, is putting time in their calendar for some of the strategic thinking and planning, because you're never going to find time between those two meetings that you just rushed out of, or trying to deliver something. So it has to be some dedicated time, and I encourage a weekly recurring time slot. And the higher you are in the organization, the more time you need for this stuff.
Excellent, excellent piece of advice. And I would extend that piece of advice to anything that you are doing to try and promote yourself.
Yeah.
Make sure you schedule that into
Yes.
your day and your week to practice these habits, to practice going, okay, I need to practice having these conversations around strategy, because what we practice and what we plan, we do.
Absolutely.
Melissa, it has been a great having you back on this show. So, as one of our key experts, what is some way that people can work with you, or do you have a free offer that can help people start to think about this strategic plan?
Absolutely. So I have opened up some time in my calendar to do a 30-minute lead from your vision and not from your inbox strategy call. So I have, there's the link to set up that call with me, and we can explore some of the challenges that you have, and perhaps set a couple of things in place for you to get to that next step of being strategic.
That's a fantastic opportunity. So, if the link will be below, and if you are looking to build more strategy, to understand strategic thinking, I really encourage you to reach out to Melissa, schedule yourself a call with her so that you can help yourself become more strategic and move up the corporate ladder.
And I only have a few spots per week because I'm quite busy. So if you get in there first, you'll probably get some of the sooner spots.
Yeah, so don't wait.
Yeah.
Don't wait. Melissa, thank you. It has been a great pleasure to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Nancy. Thank you.